Dispatch, unit clear at the heavy machinery yard. Starting search.
Okay, everyone, listen up. K9 unit takes the east side, drone support covers the ridge. Move out in 5.
That morning, a thick veil of fog settled over the pine forests of southern Kentucky. It was the kind of fog that made the whole landscape feel as if it had slipped back a few decades, making every sound more distant and quieter than usual. A crew of workers had just started their shift on a stretch of land slated for a new housing project. A piece of property forgotten for many years, sitting right off Route 90, the road locals like to call the one that never slept. Around 9 in the morning, the steady hum of the excavator suddenly faltered. Then another sound rose up sharper, hollow, echoing through the damp soil. The operator stopped, climbed out of the cab, and stepped down into the mud. Beneath the dark, slick earth, a faint shimmer of pale blue metal began to show. At first, they thought it might be part of an old oil drum or a piece of abandoned construction equipment left behind years ago. But with just one more scoop of the bucket, everyone knew this wasn't something that belonged here. A curved line of metal emerged, then shards of shattered glass, then a roof crushed inward from years of weight pressing down. People gathered around the pit, silent, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. They knew they had just uncovered something no one had been able to find for 21 years. A buried car, held in place by layers of soil and roots, as though nature itself had been trying to hide a sorrowful story. When the first officer stepped down into the excavation, the ground was still slick with rain from the night before. The air carried a heaviness that was hard to name. A feeling like stepping into a space where time had stopped long ago. On the exposed portion of the car's roof, the once vibrant blue had faded until only a ghost of color remained. But for anyone who had grown up in this area, that shade was unmistakably familiar. No one said it aloud, but they all understood they were standing at the beginning of a story swallowed by time. A story the whole town had learned to keep quiet about just to go on living. Yet in that moment, with the car lying still in the wet earth, it felt as though every secret of the past 2 decades was finally being forced into the light. Audrey May was the kind of person a small town could love without effort. A 23-year-old with gentle eyes who always carried a notebook, afraid to lose any idea that might help her someday become a journalist. She had grown up in Somerset, where the back roads were woven into childhood memory, where her mother baked on weekend nights and her father turned on the porch light whenever he heard a car slowing in front of the house. On the 21st of October, 1994, Audrey left campus to come home, just as she always did. It was a short trip, only a few hours along a road that wound through pine woods and the quiet little towns of Kentucky. But that night, her car never appeared at the end of the driveway, where the porch light had been glowing since early evening. Audrey's disappearance was more than a missing person case. It was a void left in a family, a lingering ache in a community, and a question that remained unanswered for more than 2 decades. All of Kentucky once followed the search for her, only to fall silent when every lead abruptly faded away. No one ever imagined that the secret had been so close, lying just beneath the dirt of a road thousands of people traveled every day. And it took 21 years for the truth to push its way up through the old roots and the dark soil, carrying with it a story an entire generation would never forget. When Audrey May vanished on the road she had driven hundreds of times, the story became far more than a disappearance. It opened a long stretch of darkness that lasted 21 years, long enough for a generation to grow up, long enough for a family to be worn down by hope and heartbreak. People kept wondering what could possibly cause a young woman, clear-minded, careful, and full of dreams, to disappear in the middle of a journey so familiar it felt like part of her own home. Who had been driving the same direction that night? Who had stood behind her at the gas station in Bowling Green? And what happened just a few miles after she called her mother, promising she would be home before it got too dark? Those questions hovered like fog over Kentucky's fields, so thick everyone felt them, yet no one could see through them. Why had there been no trace, no skid marks, no belongings left behind, no witnesses? A car and a young woman had slipped off the map of their own lives as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. What could be powerful enough to erase a disappearance in a place where every passing car leaves a trail of dust behind it? But the question that haunted people the most wasn't what happened in Audrey's final minutes. It was why it took 21 years to uncover the truth. 21 years of her parents turning on the porch light each night, 21 years of volunteers remembering clearly the day they searched the endless pine forests, 21 years of her car lying still beneath the soil, only a few steps from the road. Who hid it? Who wanted it gone so completely? And why did the quiet land of Kentucky hold that secret for so long? Those are the questions that will guide us through this story. Questions that once weighed heavily on an entire town. And today, now that the truth has finally been found, we understand that some answers don't live in evidence or case files, they live in the grief of the people left behind. Before her name ever appeared in missing person reports, Audrey May was simply a young woman living a quiet but warm life. She was born and raised in Somerset, a southern town where everyone knew one another, and where autumn passed in the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. Audrey was the oldest child in her family, gentle, thoughtful, and always the one who softened the house with her signature tender smile. Her mother recalled that even as a little girl, Audrey loved observing everything around her. She scribbled notes on scraps of paper, which grew into diary pages, which later turned into the journal entries that fueled her dream of becoming a reporter when she left for college. She wasn't the type who sought excitement or crowds. She loved quiet afternoons at the Western Kentucky University Library, sipping a cheap cup of coffee and writing until the last light of the day slipped down the side of the old brick buildings. Friends described Audrey as someone who listened far more than she talked. She knew how to ask questions that made other people feel important. Those things might seem small, but they were the reasons so many remembered her so deeply. In class, Audrey was never the loudest or the most noticeable, but she was the person people wanted beside them when life felt too heavy. Her family was her greatest anchor. Every weekend, Audrey drove back to Somerset. It was a habit she had kept since high school. Each Friday, she walked through the front door to the smell of fresh-baked bread and her father calling out from the garage. The small house, the warm amber porch light, the line of maple trees in the yard, all of it was Audrey's world. A peaceful world filled with love, where she had never learned to be afraid of anything. Audrey's dreams were simple and beautifully ordinary. She hoped to intern at a small newspaper, to write about the people of her town, the overlooked stories that quietly form the heart of a community. She dreamed that one day she would publish a book collecting the journeys she had taken, the faces that had taught her to believe in kindness. For Audrey, life was never about grand achievements. It was simply the feeling of coming home after a long week, listening to her mother talk about the neighbors, sitting in the kitchen with a bowl of hot soup when the weather turned cold. Those small, ordinary things shaped her. A gentle, dreamy, cautious girl who believed the world was vast but safe. Perhaps that is why Audrey's disappearance broke people's hearts even more. Because when someone like her vanishes in the middle of everyday life, it touches a fear buried deep within each of us that even the simplest, most beautiful lives can be interrupted without warning. And that there are people, like Audrey, whom you only need to know once to remember forever. To understand Audrey May's story, we have to look back at the place where everything began. Kentucky in the 1990s was both peaceful and haunting, a land where pine forests stretched endlessly, where morning fog could swallow the road ahead, and where people still greeted one another with a familiar nod when passing the old gas station by the roadside. It was a place so serene it was beautiful, but also the kind of place where secrets could sleep for a very long time beneath soft soil and unused turnoffs. In that setting, a seemingly ordinary name later appeared quietly in the case files. James R. Coleman, a middle-aged construction contractor, the kind of man most people saw without really noticing, someone doing hard labor, living simply, never drawing attention. He wore a faded denim jacket, drove a rattling old pickup through town each morning, and rarely spoke unless work required it. Coleman had grown up around small construction sites, accustomed to the smell of machine oil and damp earth. He was not the kind of person who left a strong impression. Neighbors remembered him in vague phrases. Not very talkative. Always on time. Keeps to himself. The sort of person you don't think about until you have to. Back then, in small southern towns, there were many people like that, quiet, unremarkable, but undeniably woven into the fabric of the community. But there was one thing about Coleman few people ever noticed: his familiarity with dirt roads, with half-finished work sites along the woods, and especially his ability to operate heavy machines capable of leveling an entire hill. Those things were ordinary in his line of work. But in a missing person case, they became details that made people shudder when looking back. Kentucky in that decade had few cameras. No satellite tracking, no technology that recorded every movement. People relied on intuition, on what they saw and what they heard from neighbors. Wide stretches of land, dark roads, and rarely visited areas created the perfect backdrop for anything unusual to be swallowed whole. And within that picture, Coleman was a shadow on the edge. No suspicion, no attention. No one imagined that a man living such a quiet, monotonous life in Kentucky could be tied to a mystery that lasted 21 years. Only when Audrey's car was unearthed, and when Coleman's name appeared in the investigative report, did people begin looking at one another differently, astonished, with a dawning sense that they had missed something from the very beginning. Because sometimes, the perpetrator isn't the person who stands out. Sometimes he is simply the man behind the wheel of an old truck, passing by on a gray afternoon, leaving no memory at all, until the truth begins to rise out of the ground. The 21st of October, 1994 began like any other day for Audrey May. She had just finished her midterm week at Western Kentucky University, tired but relieved. On the small desk in her dorm room lay the notebook where she had scribbled a few ideas for her next essay. Audrey packed quickly, bringing only her books, a light jacket, and the canvas bag her mother had sewn for her during her freshman year. She told everyone, as she always did, that she would be home before the late dinner hour. At around 6:30, Audrey left campus. The sun was sinking behind the rolling hills, leaving that deep orange glow Kentucky was known for at the end of autumn. The road to Somerset had become routine over her college years, long but peaceful, threaded between pine forests and small gas stations glowing with soft yellow light. Audrey put on a favorite cassette tape and let the night wind drift in through the cracked window, thinking about helping her mother with the holiday decorations that weekend. At around 6:47, Audrey stopped at a small gas station near Bowling Green, a worn-down place, but familiar to travelers. There, she called her mother from a payphone beside the glass door. The call was brief. She said she was fine, just picking up a few things, and would soon be back on the road. On the other end, her mother reminded her to drive safely and, as always, promised to leave the porch light on. Audrey bought a soda, a pack of gum, and paid for her gas. The station attendant later said she had been polite, offering a gentle smile as if nothing in the world could trouble her. And that peaceful moment would become the detail that broke many hearts when people remembered her later. But what etched that stop into the attendant's memory was the appearance of a dark green pickup truck that pulled in right after Audrey. The truck did not refuel and did not buy anything. It sat at the edge of the lot, engine rumbling low, as if waiting for something. The driver stayed inside, his face buried in shadow. When Audrey left the station, the truck rolled out as well, keeping just enough distance not to draw attention, but never far enough to lose the glow of her taillights. From that point on, Audrey's journey home existed only in theories and painful imagination. Darkness fell fast. The pine woods on either side of the road thickened, turning the world a dense blue-black. Streetlights grew sparse, disappearing entirely along certain stretches where only the sound of wind brushing through the treetops followed her. No one knows whether Audrey noticed the truck behind her. No one knows whether she felt fear when she glanced into the rearview mirror. Whatever happened in those final miles stayed buried with her beneath a layer of earth, hidden for more than 20 years before any light reached it. When Audrey didn't appear at the end of the driveway as night settled in, her father stood for a long time on the porch. He stared out at the dark stretch of road and told himself she might have gotten stuck at a turn, or that the cold air had made her drive slower. But as each minute passed, unease crept into every breath. Her mother paced the kitchen, keeping the lights on as if the brightness itself could call her daughter home. When the clock struck midnight, the family knew something was wrong. Audrey had never broken a promise. She had never given her parents a reason to worry without explanation. And that night, on the quiet road cutting through Kentucky where only headlights and the soft stirring of the forest broke the silence, Audrey May stepped into the longest stillness of her life. A stillness the entire state would never forget. One that left people wondering how a young woman could vanish from the face of the earth without leaving a single trace. When the family reported her missing the next morning, local police began the kind of work they had done many times before in cases of stalled cars or young people running late after falling asleep at a friend's house. But within just a few hours, everyone understood Audrey's case was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The road from Bowling Green to Somerset was divided into manageable segments. It wasn't a dangerous mountain route, nor did it have steep drops where cars easily lost control. Yet when search teams began their sweep, they realized something that made the entire operation feel strange. There were no signs Audrey had ever encountered trouble, no tire marks slipping off the pavement, no evidence of a collision, no fragments of broken glass. It was as if her car had never traveled that way at all. Police drove slowly, examining every meter of road, stopping at empty lots, dirt turnoffs leading into the woods, and stretches so deserted that only the wind whispering through the tall pines broke the silence. Helicopters were deployed, sweeping light across streams and marshy ground. Volunteers from elderly neighbors to college students who had never met Audrey formed long lines, stepping carefully through damp fields. Whenever someone bent down at the sight of something glinting in the grass, the entire group held its breath. But each time, it was only an old soda can, a rusted scrap of metal, or a discarded bottle. Time passed, but no one found even the smallest trace of Audrey. Her car had vanished completely, as if lifted from the ground and carried elsewhere. This not only complicated the investigation but planted fear in the hearts of the searchers. A young woman, traveling along a familiar route, had disappeared within mere minutes, with no evidence left behind. It was the kind of thing that made the people of Kentucky uneasy, in a way they struggled to describe. Audrey's family spent nearly the entire day at the search command post. Her father carried a map, marking each area that had been swept, trying to stay calm, though his hands trembled slightly every time an officer approached with an update. Her mother handed out flyers to anyone who passed. Her voice had grown hoarse after hours of repeating the same words. Please look out for a blue Honda Civic. Please call if you notice anything unusual. Her worry was no longer just a feeling, it had become part of her heart from the moment her daughter didn't come home. In the days that followed, the search radius expanded by dozens of miles. People checked every small bridge, every patch of land along the river, every narrow trail hunters often used. The Kentucky woods in late October carried a kind of sorrowful beauty. Light filtered through the thinning branches, forming long streaks across the ground, making everything appear wrapped in a pale mist. It was a landscape that made the search feel even heavier, beautiful in its stillness, and so still it became unsettling. The more they searched, the clearer one truth became. Audrey had not crashed. Audrey had not walked away from her life. Something or someone had taken her presence from the world in a way no one could comprehend. By the end of the first week, police had to admit they were running out of leads. There was no scene, no witnesses, and no indication that Audrey had taken any road other than the one leading home from the gas station. Hope sagged under the weight of that realization. Searchers began wondering if they had been standing painfully close to the very place she had vanished yet somehow not seen it. And it is heartbreaking to know that during those days, they had passed the place holding the answer. Just a few steps from the main road, buried under a thick layer of earth, Audrey's car lay still. A secret so deeply hidden it would take more than 20 years before it surfaced, carrying with it a sorrow these early days barely hinted at. As those first days slipped by with no trace at all, the investigation into Audrey May's disappearance entered a state of urgency, tangled with uncertainty. Without a clear scene, police were forced to rely on the smallest details. The faint fragments of the night Audrey vanished. And in Kentucky in 1994, everything moved slower. Limited technology, rare traffic cameras, paper files stacked in metal cabinets that smelled of dampness. All they had were human memories And memory is a fragile thing, always clouded by time and worry. One of the only leads came from the gas station attendant who had seen Audrey buy her items and leave. He remembered her for her gentle smile and the way she said, "Thank you." But what haunted him afterward was the dark green pickup truck parked alone at the edge of the lot. The driver never stepped out. The cabin was so dim, no face could be seen. When Audrey pulled away, the truck eased out soon after, following her at a distance. A detail that seemed small, yet caused investigators to spend hours trying to understand it. Police attempted to trace the truck, but there were no cameras, no license plate, and no other witnesses who had seen it on the road. Months later, that single detail would become a persistent rumor in the community. A strange truck, a shadowy figure, an odd moment in the night. But at the time, investigators had nothing certain enough to steer the case toward a specific suspect. They also looked into the people who knew Audrey. Her classmates all said she had no conflicts with anyone. She wasn't in debt. She had no complicated relationships. She was the kind of person everyone liked, making the idea that she would walk away from her life almost impossible. Still, in missing person cases, police had to examine every possibility. They spoke with everyone connected to her, but in the end, every answer sounded the same. Audrey was kind, responsible, and simply not someone who would disappear without a word. Another investigative path focused on the possibility of an accident, but when every patch of low ground, riverbank, and trail had been searched thoroughly, police were forced to admit there wasn't a single sign the car had ever left the road. The case began to resemble a paradox. A person cannot simply vanish, but Audrey had vanished in the most literal sense. The stalemate made even the smallest scraps of information feel like leads worth digging up, examining, and then setting aside again. A few locals said they had seen headlights turning into the woods that night, but they couldn't place the exact time. A long-haul trucker thought he saw a blue Civic driving unusually slow, but he wasn't certain it was Audrey. These fragments of memory were blurred by fear, colored differently each time the stories were retold. Investigators wrote everything down, but nothing could be relied upon. Police also briefly suspected a homeless man who often slept in an old pickup truck near the area. He had been seen around the gas station in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. They questioned him several times, checked his truck, inspected his clothing, but found nothing connecting him to the case. Eventually, he was cleared of suspicion. Yet in the years that followed, the shadow of doubt that had once been cast over him continued to unsettle the community because people couldn't bear the idea that the culprit might have been very close and they hadn't recognized him. As time passed, the pressure grew. Newspapers began reporting on the case. Residents whispered about it. Flyers with Audrey's face appeared in shops, gas stations, and churches across the region. But the more people knew, the more false sightings the police received. Someone claimed to have seen her at a roadside diner. Someone else insisted they'd spotted a girl who looked like Audrey walking through the woods. All of them were wrong. Each small spark of hope was extinguished almost immediately, leaving Audrey's family nearly exhausted. Her father continued driving the same route every morning. He stopped at places only he understood, looking down into dark cuts in the earth, listening to the forest as if it might answer him. He told reporters he felt his daughter was somewhere very close. No one understood why he believed that. But later, when the truth was finally uncovered, people realized just how painfully accurate his intuition had been. The initial investigation ended in heavy silence. No evidence. No suspects. No direction. A case with no beginning and no end. And during those years, the mystery of Audrey shifted from a missing person report into a haunting that spread across Kentucky, a story everyone remembered, but none knew how to begin telling. After months of fruitless searching, Audrey May's disappearance slowly sank into the quiet memory of Kentucky. People didn't forget her, but the initial shock faded into a wound softened by time. The flyers once taped to gas stations, diners, and church doors began to fade in the sun. Audrey's name moved from the front page to the back columns, and eventually disappeared from the newspapers, entirely surviving only in whispered conversations, among those who still couldn't believe a girl like her had been swallowed from the world. Audrey's family, however, never truly let go. Her mother kept the habit of turning on the porch light every night, a habit she said was to light the way in case Audrey comes home late. That light glowed for years, replaced bulb after bulb, becoming a small symbol of hope, a silent prayer. Her father kept driving the same route from that year, even knowing it wouldn't change anything, he continued. He stopped at the quietest stretches, standing there for a few minutes before moving on. He couldn't explain why, only that he felt something had gone unseen. The 1990s slowly came to an end. New cases appeared, and other faces were added to the missing person lists. Audrey May's name became a thin folder in a cold filing cabinet. The original investigators were transferred or retired. Local residents still mentioned the case from time to time, but always with a bitter acknowledgement that they might never know the truth. By the early 2000s, technology began reshaping criminal investigations, but Audrey's case file had nothing to re-examine. No DNA, no personal items, no soil samples or trace evidence to indicate which direction she had taken after leaving the gas station. The case remained frozen in complete uncertainty. Then in the year 2011, something small but pivotal happened. Inspector Lee Barnett, newly transferred to the unit, was assigned to review old case files and reorganize the storage system. Among dozens of dusty boxes, she found a thin folder with a yellowed cover and a handwritten tab. Audrey May. Missing. 1994. Barnett didn't know much about the case, but from the very first lines of the report, she felt something was off. Fragmented details, inconsistent notes, questions that had never been answered simply because the clues had been too few. In most missing person cases, investigators managed to find at least one small indicator. But here, everything was completely empty. One detail made Barnett pause for a long time. The file mentioned that the stretch of road near where Audrey was believed to have traveled had been temporarily closed due to unstable ground. During the very week she disappeared. The note was written in tiny handwriting at the bottom of the report, almost insignificant. But Barnett understood that the smallest things were often what the original investigation had overlooked. She followed the trail through the Department of Transportation records and discovered that the area had once been worked on by an independent construction crew. Their documentation was incomplete. A small company, misplaced paperwork, nearly all traces erased by time. But to Barnett, that was not an ending. It was a signal, an unusual road, a coincidental timing, a secret that might have been lying beneath that soil for 2 decades. Barnett requested a geological scan of the area, but her proposal was denied due to high cost and lack of evidence linking the site to the case. Audrey's file was once again placed on the unresolved list, but this time, it was no longer forgotten. At least, not by Barnett. She kept a private notebook. It held only a few lines. Road closed. Records missing. Unstable terrain. And at the bottom of the page, a sentence that would send chills down many spines years later. Something is under the ground. It would take another 4 years before that secret truly emerged. It would take 21 years for the Earth to finally return the answer that a family and an entire state had been waiting for in anguish. On a May morning in the year 2015, a thin layer of fog wrapped itself around Kentucky's pine ridges like a veil over a long-kept secret. It was the morning the construction crew began clearing the foundation for a new housing development on a strange triangular plot of land that had been abandoned for decades because it was considered unstable. To them, it was just another workday. But for Audrey May, it was the morning the silence of 21 years began to crack open. At around 9:20, a sharp, hollow clang rang out from one of the excavators. At first, the operator thought he'd struck a rock or an old steel pipe, but the sound was too sharp, too empty, and he shut the machine down immediately. When others ran over, they saw, beneath the damp soil, a faint streak of blue emerging, curved like the roof of a car. No one spoke for several seconds. Because in that moment, they all felt something heavy. Something that didn't belong to a construction site. The site manager called the police. Within an hour, the area was sealed off. Patrol cars lined the road that had once been the familiar route of countless travelers for more than 2 decades. When investigators climbed down to examine the pit, they saw that the entire body of the car had been crushed under the pressure of time and soil. Thick pine roots had grown through the door frame, wrapping around the vehicle as if it were part of the forest itself. The blue paint had faded almost completely, but still enough remained for them to recognize the distinct color printed on hundreds of flyers all those years ago. A small metal emblem on the front of the car caught a glint of sunlight. Honda, the same model Audrey had driven. The entire site fell silent, so quiet that only the wind slipping through the pines could be heard. A young officer stood motionless, then whispered, "I think we've found her." The excavation had to be done slowly. Soil was removed layer by layer to avoid damaging the interior. And when the car door was finally opened, the air grew heavy. Inside, on the driver's seat, were human remains worn down by time. The fabric of the clothing had deteriorated almost completely, but enough remained to show it was student attire. A waterlogged notebook lay on the floor, warped but still holding its final pages, the same pages Audrey had carried from campus that night. One small object resting between the driver's seat and the console made the entire investigative team freeze: a silver crescent moon keychain. It was the gift Audrey's mother had given her when she was accepted into college. Something Audrey always kept with her. Only 1 hour after the VIN number was checked, authorities confirmed that the car was indeed the blue Honda Civic that had vanished with Audrey in the year 1994. The news spread across Kentucky like a tearing wind. That afternoon, people who had never met Audrey came to stand quietly behind the police barricade. Some gathered in small groups, whispering to one another. Others simply stood still, staring into the excavation site as though looking into a tragedy time had never been able to soften. When police informed Audrey's father, he fell silent. He held the photograph of the unearthed car for a long time, his trembling hands gripping the edges. He said only one sentence: "I knew she was close. I always knew." Later reports revealed that the car had not fallen into the ground by accident. It had been buried. The compacted soil indicated the use of heavy machinery, meaning someone had intentionally erased the existence of both the car and Audrey. That revelation did more than reopen the case. It haunted everyone who had participated in the search 21 years earlier. They had once stood directly over that ground. They had called Audrey's name in a place only a few meters from her car, and none of them had known that the answer had been right beneath their feet, buried by a hand all too familiar with soil and machines. As the car was lifted from the earth, clumps of mud and roots fell away like layers of time being peeled back. It was not just a car, it was a witness to a concealed truth, a final call home from a young woman Kentucky had never forgotten. Finding the car did more than reopen the case. It ignited an undercurrent that had been sleeping beneath the Kentucky community for 21 years. As soon as investigators began analyzing the excavation site, they realized this was not a random location. The soil had been compacted in an unnatural way. Its structure showed signs of having been dug up and then refilled using heavy machinery. Not rain, not time, not a natural accident. This was human work, the work of someone who knew how to operate powerful equipment. When this detail entered the official report, the first name to surface did so not because of direct evidence, but because of a chilling coincidence. The company responsible for the construction area in 1994 was Coleman Excavation Services, and the man listed as its operator, the one overseeing roadwork at that exact time, was James R. Coleman. For young investigators reading the file for the first time, the name meant nothing. But for longtime residents of Barron County, it made them pause. Not because he was famous or well-respected, but because he was the kind of man everyone had seen, yet no one could remember clearly. James Coleman was born and raised on work sites of red dirt, rumbling engines, and the familiar smell of oil and machinery. He wasn't someone drawn to city lights. His life revolved around back roads, rural improvement projects along the woods, and the kind of work where a single mistake could trigger a landslide or a collapsed roadbed. People described him as withdrawn, quiet, punctual, and someone who rarely held eye contact for more than a few seconds. But there was something else about Coleman, something the community had nearly forgotten. He had a history of violence. Old records showed a serious altercation with a woman in the late 1980s. The case never progressed due to lack of evidence and a withdrawn statement. But for an experienced investigator, that is never a detail to dismiss. Past behavior often casts a long shadow. When investigator Barnett flipped through the old documents, she realized that the so-called landslide incident fell exactly within the time window of Audrey's disappearance. A coincidence too large to ignore. She began digging into early records from 1994 and discovered that the temporarily closed road, shut down for unstable ground, lay entirely within the area where the car had been found. The connection between Coleman's work and the burial site forced her to ask the question, was this mere coincidence, or had someone used the construction zone, the excavators, and the soft soil to cover up something far more horrific? Those suspicions only grew stronger when the lab unexpectedly found a clue among the preserved evidence. A faint fingerprint on the cap of the fuel tank. In 1994, it had been dismissed as unusable due to poor clarity. But with modern technology, specialists restored it, and the result left everyone silent. The print matched James R. Coleman. No one expected that after so many years, any trace would remain, but sometimes the truth finds a way to survive, even when buried under the earth for decades. But the evidence wasn't only in the lab. An older man named David Lair, who had worked on Coleman's crew that year, recalled a night he could never forget. He remembered Coleman telling the entire team to go home early because the ground had shifted after the rain. But when they returned the next morning, a large section of soil had been neatly leveled despite no weather report showing a heavy rainstorm that night. That testimony highlighted exactly what Barnett had long suspected. Someone had worked alone in the dark. Someone who didn't want anyone to know what had been buried beneath that soil. When police tracked down Coleman in the year 2015, he was a much older man. Gray hair, a rough, low voice, eyes difficult to read. He calmly said he remembered the construction area from that year, remembered the soft earth, remembered the poor road conditions. But when asked about Audrey, he acted distant, as though it were someone else's story entirely. Yet one sentence made investigators stop writing mid-note. When asked about the section of road that had been temporarily closed, Coleman muttered, "That stretch shouldn't have been reopened that quickly." Why would a man who claimed he barely remembered anything be able to recall the exact timeline of a project from 21 years earlier? That question became the center of the investigation. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer things became. Coleman was not just a coincidental name in the file. He was someone with the tools, the access to the area, the experience in moving soil, a history of violence, and now a fingerprint on Audrey's car. For years, justice had remained silent because the pieces had never been placed next to one another. But now, with the car risen from the earth, every trail began pointing to a single name, James R. Coleman. A shadow who had once stood quietly at the edges of the case was now the focal point of the truth Kentucky had been waiting more than 2 decades to uncover. The trial of James R. Coleman in the spring of the year 2016 was one of those moments Kentucky would never forget, not because of noise outside the courthouse, but because of the breathless silence of those who had waited far too long for the truth. 21 years is enough for a generation to grow up, enough for a family to be worn thin by waiting, and enough for justice to finally find its way back. Inside the courtroom that day, sunlight spilled through tall windows, forming bright bands like dividing lines between past and present. On one side, Coleman sat with an unreadable calm, his hands folded before him, his eyes revealing little. On the other side, Audrey's family sat quietly, holding old photographs whose edges had been blurred by time. To them, this was not a trial. It was a final farewell for a daughter taken far too soon. The prosecutor began by presenting the evidence that had never existed 2 decades earlier. They spoke of the Honda Civic buried deep underground. They spoke of Coleman's matching fingerprint on the fuel cap. They spoke of the road closure that occurred precisely when Audrey vanished, and the chilling overlap between his construction work and the burial site. Then they projected onto the courtroom screen an image of the excavation pit where the car had been uncovered. The blue paint had nearly faded away, yet enough remained to mark the remnants of a life buried. Soft sobs echoed when the prosecutor displayed the silver crescent moon keychain found inside the car. It was the item Audrey always carried, a small symbol that said more than any accusation. When the prosecutor moved to witness testimony, the silence in the courtroom deepened. David Lear, the former worker on Coleman's crew, recounted the night Coleman abruptly sent everyone home early, and how, by the next morning, the ground near the road had been perfectly leveled, as if someone had worked alone through the night. His story made several people shiver. It aligned with every scientific conclusion about the burial site. Next, the prosecutor presented Coleman's fragmented but contradictory statements from his final interrogation. He claimed he had only wanted to help Audrey find her way. He claimed everything happened too fast. But the truth was that there was no sign of an accident. There was no explanation for soil that had been dug up and compacted by machinery. There was no reason an innocent man would bury a car and hide the truth for 21 years. The defense attempted to paint Coleman as an elderly man with fading memory, arguing that he could not recall events from so long ago. But evidence is not something swayed by sentiment. It lay in the earth, it lay in the machinery, it lay in Coleman's own murmured words when he said that stretch of road should not have been reopened that quickly. The trial reached its end when the prosecutor spoke the final sentence. Audrey spent 21 years beneath the ground, while James Coleman walked over it as if nothing had happened. Today, that ends. The jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, everyone held their breath. The judge read each word slowly. Guilty. All charges. No possibility of bail. No leniency. Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a heavy sentence, but a fitting one for the 21 years of silence he had left behind. In that moment, Audrey's father bowed his head, his hands trembling slightly, but he did not cry. He simply whispered a sentence that those nearby heard. She deserved to hear this. A long time ago. Coleman was escorted out of the courtroom to the rustling of papers and the quiet sobs of people who had searched for Audrey for years. He looked at no one, spoke to no one, but for everyone present that day, the verdict was more than justice. It was the closing of a painful chapter that had stretched across 2 decades, and for the first time in a very long while, Kentucky felt as if the ground beneath it had grown a little lighter. When the trial ended, when the sentence was announced, when James Coleman was taken away in the transport vehicle, many thought the 21-year ache might finally ease. But for Audrey's family, it was only the final step in a journey they had never wanted to take. Justice may arrive late, but what is taken away never returns. The small house in Somerset remained just as it had been when Audrey was alive. On the porch, the light her mother had once switched on each night continued to glow, kept lit by her father long after Audrey's body was found. He said the habit had rooted itself in his heart, that turning it off felt like turning off the hope that had kept him standing for 2 decades. And though he now knew his daughter would never come home, that light remained as a reminder of how fiercely he had loved her and waited for her. Neighbors in town said that on many nights, they saw Harold May standing in the yard, looking into the darkness in front of the house. His expression no longer carried hope, but there was still something resolute there, as if he were holding on to one final promise to Audrey, that no matter what happened, he would never forget her. The people who had searched for Audrey all those years ago now had families, lives of their own, yet in each of their memories remained the image of a cold morning when they had walked in a line beneath the pine trees, calling the name of a girl they had never met. When the car was unearthed, many of them wept from guilt. They had walked right above where Audrey lay. They had stood there. They had believed they had done everything they could. But they could never have known that the truth was buried directly beneath their feet. In the town of Somerset, Audrey's story became a reminder no one wanted, but no one could forget. Parents began telling their children to be more careful on quiet roads. Night drivers warned one another about the stretches of forested highway, and anyone passing the patch of land where the car was found slowed down, even for just a few seconds. There was something sacred about that place, not because of the haunting, but because it was where a young woman had lain in silence for 21 years, unnoticed by the world. At Western Kentucky University, A small ceremony was held to honor Audrey. Former classmates said she had a smile that made others feel lighter, a girl full of dreams, someone who loved writing, who loved capturing the small stories of everyday life. One of her professors said Audrey was never loud, but she had the eyes of someone who wanted to do something meaningful for the world. Some students from those years said they still kept Audrey's old essays pages, now yellowed with age. Reading them again, they said it felt as if Audrey's voice rose from the paper, gentle but steady, as though she were still somewhere nearby, just walking a little more slowly on her way home. For the community, the case left a deep wound. Not only because of the grief of losing her, but because it forced people to face the truth that sometimes evil can stand beside us for years without our knowing. Coleman had walked the same roads they walked. He had bought coffee from the same shops they visited. That alone made his name linger with a cold weight, long after the trial ended. Yet even so, people found in this story something of faith, not faith that everything would be good, but faith in continuing to search for answers, even when those answers are buried beneath the soil of time. Audrey's friends and family said the most important thing was not the trial or the sentence. The important thing was that the truth had finally been found, that Audrey no longer lay in silence, that her story was told fully, completely, and that Kentucky, even if late, had stopped to listen. The pain remained, unchanged. But at the very least, the truth had finally returned to the people who deserved to know it. When the trials were over, when justice was spoken beneath the judge's bench, what remained in the hearts of those who listened was not the verdict, but a question that seemed simple yet could shake anyone who had followed Audrey May's journey. Why must a gentle, careful girl who believed in good things face such a fate? And what can we, those hearing her story years later, learn from a path marked by such loss? The first lesson the case reminds us of is the fragility of the things we think are certain. Audrey drove on a familiar road. She called her mother as she always did. She even smiled at the gas station attendant. No one in those moments imagined that Kentucky's peaceful sky was about to close over her. But life sometimes shifts in a single instant, one unexpected presence, one stretch of bad road, one passing moment, and everything changes color. It reminds us that nothing is so safe that we can take it for granted. The second lesson comes from the journey of those who remained. 21 years is an unbearably long time for a family to hold on to hope. But they held on not because they were blind to the painful possibilities, but because deep down, human beings cling to even the smallest thread in order to keep moving. The porch light Audrey's mother switched on each night was not just a symbol of hope. It was the one force keeping that family from breaking beneath what they could not control. Audrey's story also reminds us of the value of community. Hundreds of people searched for her in those early days. Strangers stepped forward to help not because they knew her, but because they understood that the disappearance of a young woman was a sorrow shared by the entire town. And when the car was found 21 years later, many cried not only out of grief, but because they had been there, had tried, had hoped. That quiet sense of guilt was not responsibility, it was the most human form of empathy. The case also raised questions about silence. The silence of overlooked details. The silence of technology that had not yet advanced enough. The silence of a man who believed the earth could hide everything. But truth has a very particular way of existing. It can be covered, buried, pressed beneath tons of soil, but it does not disappear. It simply waits for someone patient enough, brave enough, determined enough to pull it back into the light. This brings us to the most important lesson. Justice does not come quickly, does not come easily, and sometimes arrives so late it makes the heart ache. But it does come because of people who believe in truth, like Inspector Barnett, who examined every small detail others had overlooked. People like her remind us that justice is not something that happens naturally. It is effort. It is persistence. It is the belief that no one deserves to be forgotten beneath the layers of time. And in the end, Audrey's story asks us to look at our own lives. We move too quickly. We dismiss hurried goodbyes, a brief phone call, a tiny smile from someone we love. Yet when tragedy strikes, those are the moments we remember most deeply, the ones we hold on to longest. Audrey did not know that the phone call from the pay booth that night would be her last words to her mother. But it reminds us that every moment, with the people we love, has value. Audrey May is not just a name in a case file. She is a reminder that life is fragile, that kindness must be protected, that truth will always find its way back no matter how deeply it is buried, and that each of us carries a responsibility to retell her story so that she is never forgotten. Because in the end, the only force stronger than the darkness of 2 decades is our remembering her the right way, with compassion, with the belief that even the smallest things can change an entire life. As Audrey May's story closes, what remains is not only sorrow, it is the feeling that a door has finally opened after years of stillness, allowing light to shine into a place long held by shadows. This case is not simply about the tragic end of a young woman. It is about the persistence of people who refuse to let the truth stay buried. It is about the love of a family who waited with everything they had, even when hope flickered like a fragile porch light trembling in the night wind. 21 years is an entire lifetime. For Audrey, it was a lifetime stolen. For her parents, it was 2 decades of sleepless nights, of questions no one could answer. For Kentucky, it was a small fracture in the heart of a community that once believed it was safe. But within those same years, people learned that some stories never fade, not as long as someone keeps them alive through memory, through kindness, through the belief that every unfinished journey deserves to be carried all the way to its end. Now, the place where the car was found has become part of a new neighborhood. Houses have risen, children play, and laughter echoes through the pines that once hid a secret for far too long. Life moves on, as it must. But for those who know the story, each time they pass by, they still slow down just a little. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because that place once held a young woman the whole state of Kentucky searched for in vain. Now it stands as a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to be seen. If we listen long enough, we might feel that something of Audrey still lingers there. Maybe it's the warmth from the journal pages she carried that night. Maybe it's the gentle look people remember. Maybe it's just the faint echo of a life that still had so much to say. But more important than anything else, it is a reminder that we do not tell these stories just to find a culprit or reconstruct a scene. We tell them to keep a person's memory alive, to make sure they do not become a number, a file, a blurred corner of history. The story of Audrey May cannot offer a perfect ending. There is no beautiful conclusion to a loss so great. But there is release, a late peace, a truth finally brought to the surface after 21 years. And in that moment, the May family's porch light, though no longer burning, still shone in a different way in the hearts of those who knew her story. If there is anything we carry with us after hearing this story, it may be the gentle reminder that every moment with the people we love is a gift. Every phone call, every smile, every time we arrive home safely matters more than we realize. Life is fragile, and sometimes, just a single moment of slowing down, a little more caution, a closer look at something unusual around us can change the course of an entire life. Thank you for walking with Audrey to the end of her journey, because some stories only truly live when someone listens to them with their whole heart. And sometimes, that is the one thing powerful enough to push back the darkness.